solid. It's shaking the whole bench, so I don't think it's going anywhere. Hopefully not. Hello, welcome to the Perpetual Projects YouTube channel. My wife and I started this channel to document and share some of the crazy projects we get up to. Currently working on some much needed improvements around the house. We're also building a Frankenstein Jeep, fixing a broken Scion TC, and going to get started converting a carport into a workshop. Plus, who knows what else. Hello everyone, it is a cold day here in Alabama. Today we're going to get started on the Scion project. I got the motor all apart. I think I have all the parts to put it back together. We're going to start by getting everything all cleaned up, and then we're going to hone it and put the pistons and everything back in it, and then we're going to get it put back in the car and see if we can get it running. But first thing we're going to do is get all the parts out and take them over there and get them cleaned up. I'm going to try something that I've never done before. We're going to try engine cleaner to degrease everything. So I'll meet you guys over there and we'll get this all cleaned up. Alright guys, well, the Simple Green heavy duty barbecue cleaner, it's not as good as what I thought it was going to be, but it got a lot of the dirt off. I mean, it's not a little bit of grease here and there that you can still get off on your finger, but it's good enough for our purposes. I'm going to go ahead and bring this over to my makeshift engine stand that I built and get the block loaded on there. First we're going to put it on upside down so we can set the crank in it, and then we're going to flip it over and start honing it and putting pistons in. But I will get this over to the engine stand. I'll meet you guys over there. Alright guys, so you can see I got the engine mounted here. I mean, it's pretty solid. It's shaking the whole bench, so I don't think it's going anywhere. Hopefully not. Next step is we're going to go ahead and get the crank out of the back of the car, get it cleaned up, and we're going to have to set up a place to set it up here. I got to just polish the bearing journals just a little bit. Alright, so we're going to do the mains first. And you're not trying to really do too much here, just kind of clean it up a little bit. And you don't want to spend too much time in any one spot. You're not trying to change the shape or the size of this at all. You're just trying to take any imperfections and scratches out of it, really. I'm going to call that good. We'll see how it does. I'm going to go get some brake cleaner and clean that one up. And the important part is after you do this, you want to make sure you get all the crud out of the hole. So there's a hole there that goes straight through. And then it also has a passage that comes up. Right. So this one's not drilled all the way through. I can see the hole in there. This comes into the side. So this passage goes to that rod. Or to that main, the rod for number one rod. That's how the oil gets to the rod bearing. But I'm just going to leave this on. I'll time lapse it and we'll finish cleaning this crank up. Alright, so we're just going to get some white Scotch-Brite, some mineral spirits, clean up our bearings, and snap the tops in here, and then we'll put some pre-lube on there and set the crank in there. for reference, you're going to have bearings with grooves. They go in the top because that's where your oil is fed to this whole system, is through these holes right here in the mains. And the solid one goes to the bottom. And then I always, when I'm doing this, I always use these blue shop towels because they're fairly lint free and you don't have to worry about getting much lint in there. Just wipe the journal out real good. Once you get your bearing all cleaned up, clean off your mating surfaces for your caps too. And I just start with the tang in its slot on that side, and then I just push that in until it seats all the way. Alright, for assembly, I just use Lucas oil stabilizer. As you can see, this one's old. I've used it a lot. Just line everything up. Carefully set the crank in there. Okay, here's our thrust bearings. I'm going to get these out, do the same thing. I'm just going to polish them up with a little bit of mineral spirits and white Scotch-Brite. And this is all standard, so that's why I'm not checking any of the clearances, because no machine work has been done. And these are King bearings. I've used those quite a bit and I've never had a problem with one being off on the size. So if you're not comfortable with that, then I recommend, you can get plastic gauge and check it. And when you put this in, the block doesn't turn, so the flat side goes against the block, the side with the oil grooves goes towards the crankshaft. If you look on here, you can see it's kind of got an arrow right there, and it's stamped on top of that. There's a 3 and a 1 here. I don't know if you can see that, but you can see right there it's stamped number 3. It's also a little bit wider to hold those thrust bearings, but that cast number is not what you're looking for. It's that stamp number with the arrow pointing towards the front of the engine is where this goes. Should fit right down on those dowels. Get a hammer and just seat that all the way down on the dowels before I put my bolts in. That gets the bolts going in nice and straight. You don't have to worry about messing any threads or anything up. And I've already verified that these threads, these bolts should spin in by hand, and I'm just going to lubricate them with a little oil. Just regular engine oil is what I'm using here. And I'm not only going to do the threads, but I'm going to do under the heads too, so that when these get down, there doesn't create extra friction under those heads. And I'm not going to put a lot of torque on these. I'm just going to snug them up just a little bit, just to make sure that main cap is all the way seated, because I like to turn it over between every bearing. And then if it sticks, then I know which bearing is causing it to stick, and it's still turning good there. And you can turn it all the way over, just to make sure that there's no problem with that bearing. Okay, so the first step on these bolts is 15. So we're going to do each one at a time. 15. And in between we're going to rotate it. Next step is 30. Then I don't have an angle torque wrench thing, so I'm just going to do them, hopefully, with this ratchet. We got to turn them 90 degrees now. So this is the hone we're going to use. Don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure you adjust this to control how much tension is on these and how fast or how much material it removes or how fast it removes material. We're going to leave this all the way up. I'm not trying to take a bunch of material out or go real fast here. I'm going to do this on the slow speed, and I'm not going to do it full throttle either. So I'm just going to use some ATF plus 4 that I had laying around. And that's where it got so windy that you couldn't hear me over the wind anymore. So right now I'm just prepping cylinder number 1 to install the piston in. I'm using a little transmission fluid on a rag to wipe anything that's left in the cylinder or has blown into the cylinder since I cleaned it out. Transmission fluid's nice because it helps protect the cylinder from rust and other things if it doesn't get it completely coated with the oil. This isn't going to sit on the engine stand long enough to matter, but it's just a good practice. I'm also cleaning the rod and making sure that it's all the way at the bottom of the stroke so I have the most room to get a hold of the rod before it contacts the crank once I put the piston in. Alright, now that we have the rod journal all cleaned up, I'm going to show you the piston. These were pretty nasty when I pulled them out of this motor. I mean, they're covered in carbon. They had lots of miles on them. So I just used mineral spirits, Scotch-Brite, and a wire brush and got them all cleaned up. Made sure I cleaned out the ring grooves so the rings would go in, move around nice and easy. There is some of that Teflon coating that is worn on the skirts, but the piston itself is not damaged. So for the purpose of this, it's not going to matter. I did line up the oil scraper rings with the wrist pin and on the gap on them on opposite sides. And then for the first and second compression ring, I put those perpendicular to the oil scraper ring and had one at the front and one at the back. When we're installing these pistons, we need to make sure that the dot on the piston goes towards the front of the engine, and then I just make sure I use lots of oil on the rings, in the ring compressor, in the cylinder, just so everything slides together nice and easy. And yeah, just started installing the pistons. After that, I just use my ring compressor and just make sure that I tap it down once I set it on top of the block to make sure that it's fully seated so that the piston rings don't pop out at the bottom, because they have a tendency to want to do that on these cheap ring compressors. And then I just went ahead and loaded all 4 pistons into the block. Tapped them down carefully, being careful not to nick the crank. Put the rod caps on and just lightly hand tight, plus just a tiny bit with a wrench. Tightened the bolts, made sure everything was good. And then I did go back and torque these to 18 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees before I put the head on. Now it's the next morning. I got the head out and I got it all cleaned up, and I didn't pull this apart. Everything looked good. I checked it with brake cleaner. None of the valves leaked, so it's just going back together. This is not a complete rebuild again. This is just a refresh. So in order to get the head bolts in, you have to pull the cams out. And once I got the cams out, I cleaned up the mating surface where the washer was going to sit on the head, just to make sure there was nothing in there that was going to change my torque specs at all. And then I oiled the bolts and made sure that I oiled the washer and the underside of the head of the bolt so that everything was nice and slicked up so it would torque well. After that, I torqued them to the spec. I don't remember what it was. I believe it was... I don't know. I'm not going to guess because I don't want to tell you wrong. But after that, I went back and torqued them, and then I did the plus 90 on all of them. And once I did that, I went ahead and put some pre-lube on, or some Lucas on the bearings, and installed the cams, making sure to get the caps lined up correctly. They're marked, they have the numbers and an arrow on them. Make sure they point forward, and then you just snug them all down, and went back and torqued them after I was done. The two in the front, the bigger bolts, are torqued at a higher spec than the other ones. And if you're doing this, it's easy to find the torque specs. If you just search for Scion TC torque specs, there's plenty of forums where all this information is available on the web. So after that, I went ahead and put the intermediate pan on. And this motor did not have balance shafts in it when I took it apart. The oil hole for the balance shaft was plugged off, and I just left it that way. I've had them that way before and they ran fine, so I just left it alone. But I went through and used the gray silicone that came in my gasket kit to place like an 1/8 inch bead all the way around, and then went back and installed all my bolts and torqued them to the proper spec. Then I put the oil pump back on. I did take it apart and inspect it before I put it on. Everything looked good, so I went in and put the oil pump and the chain on with the tensioner, and then I put the timing chain on. And again, if you want to know how to do that, all the information is available on forums and all over the web on how to time this motor. It was kind of beyond the scope of this video. After that, I put the timing chain on, or timing chain cover on, and torqued everything down on it. And then I installed the timing chain tensioner. I don't know if you noticed, I did have to replace that guide on the left side there because it was bad when I took it apart, so I just went and got a new one from the parts store. After that, put it in. When you turn this backwards, it pops the release lever on that tensioner and puts the tension on the chain. It's just spring pressure. Eventually it'll have oil pressure as well, but that's why it looks a little loose. Once it has oil pressure, it'll keep that nice and tight. After that, I put the balancer on, and I went back and torqued that afterwards, after I had it down on the ground where I could hold the motor from turning and torque it at the same time. And then I put the wiring harness on because it goes under the intake on this motor, so that has to go on before you can put the intake manifold on. I also put the water pump on and just put all of the bolts and clips and everything that are supposed to hold this wiring harness where it goes in. It does continue on to the transmission, so some of it's kind of hanging over the back there for right now. And I also left the spark plugs out until I had this mated up. Actually, I think I left the spark plugs out until I had it in the car in case I needed to turn it over, just to make sure that I wasn't trying to fight the compression of the motor while I was putting it in the car. After I had the wiring harness where it went, I cleaned the intake manifold up, and that's a little foam piece that goes between the intake manifold and the block. Just helps keep it quiet, I guess. I put it back. It was there, so I put it back. Then I just put the manifold on, started all my bolts, and brought them down evenly so it torqued nice and straight. After that, it's time to just finish up putting all the little stuff on the motor. There's the injectors. I put all new O-rings on the injectors so we didn't have no trouble with leaks. The hose stays on that fuel rail. There's a tool to take it off. I don't have one. It releases with just, you can use your hand to release it on that end of that hose further over in the motor. So then once I had the intake and all the rest of the motor put together here, I kept going back to the behind my shed over there is the motor I pulled out of this car. I had to get some sensors and some hoses and a few other things to get this motor completely buttoned up and ready to put back in the car. So then, now that I got that done, it's time to put the water pump pulley on. And there's a hole in it and a convenient little groove in the water pump that you can hold it with a screwdriver so you can get those bolts nice and tight so they won't come out. And then we got the oil pan, got it all cleaned up. And the kit came with a new gasket, so we used that. Just getting all the bolts ready, and here we go. Just start putting all the bolts in. And it's actually a little cumbersome to do this at this angle, so I ended up laying on the ground to get all the bolts started. At some point I did. And just make sure you have them all started before you tighten any of them, because you don't want to get that oil pan locked in position with one of your bolt holes partially off. Now that we have the oil pan, I guess we still... I think I actually changed one bolt because I didn't like the way it tightened down. So that's what I'm doing now. And then once the oil pan is on, it's time to put our oil filter on. And I did fill this. And you got to go kind of slow on a filter, especially on a motor that doesn't have any oil in it like this one. And make sure you get that filter topped off because it will absorb quite a bit. So got the oil all on the filter. Now we're filling the engine full of oil. Now it's time to pull the engine off here so we can put the remain seal in. We're using the cherry picker that goes in the receiver hitch on my pickup here for this project. And it picks it up real nice. And then go over there, put the rear main seal in. Once we have the rear main seal in, it's time to bring the car over. Thanks, Amber, for your help. Bring the car over, and now I'm just going to time lapse installing the motor. Hope you guys enjoy it. try to start it. See what happens. The air didn't work still. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for future projects and like this video. It sure helps us out.